From the nation's capital, the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research presents Public Policy Forums, a series of programs featuring the nation's top authorities, presenting their differing views on the vital issues which confront us. The topic, Reforming Federal Drug Regulation. Now, here is Peter Hackus.
For a variety of reasons, this country has become a nation of medicine users. We take pills, we use sprays, ointments, powders, liquids, all manner of preparations to prevent or cure anything from a hangnail to heart disease. We Americans are spending $6 billion a year on prescription drugs. Many more billions on non-prescription drugs, that is, drugs available without the signature of a physician. Congress has established the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, to ensure that the thousands of food and drug products available to consumers and patients are safe and effective. But can the FDA ensure safety and effectiveness? Has Congress established a wise policy of regulating drugs? Or is it possible to reform drug regulation in a way which will satisfy the FDA's many critics? Welcome to another roundtable discussion presented by AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan research and education organization. Today, 5 experts in the field will explore the topic, Reforming Federal Drug Regulation. They'll be tackling such questions as whether the FDA is too conservative in its approach to drug regulation. Are some drugs approved prematurely? Or is there, as some people have charged, a drug lag which keeps good drugs away from patients far too long? Moderating our discussion will be Jules Bergman, who is the science editor of ABC News. For many years, Mr. Bergman has reported scientific experimentation and exploration, including much in the field of medicine and drugs. Mr. Bergman is a member of the National Association of Science Writers. Now, to moderate our roundtable, here is Jules Bergman.
Thank you, Peter. Good evening. We are gathered for a hopefully frank and intelligent discussion of drug regulation and its problems in our society. And I think the one thing this panel would agree on is that there are problems, is that there are vast differences of opinion on how much regulation is needed, whether we have the right kind of regulation, whether new drug development is being encouraged or stifled, and whether the FDA is doing a proper kind of job. With us to freely and frankly toss bricks at one another is a distinguished group. On my left, Dr. Michael Halberstam, an internist and writer. Now, on his right, Dr. William Hubbard, president of the Upjohn Company, a little outfit that makes a few drugs here and there. On my left, or his right, Commissioner Alexander Schmidt of the Food and Drug Administration, an agency that seems to get into the news a good bit lately. On my right, Senator Gaylord Nelson, who's been deeply concerned with the state of legislation in this country and development of drugs. And on his right, one of the nation's most distinguished pharmacologists and drug experts, Dr. Lasagna of the University of Rochester, author of one of the definitive books on the field. And with that short introduction, I will pose a couple of questions, if I may, to get you gentlemen started. Not that I think any are really needed. Commissioner Schmidt, FDA seems to be... Got right to the point, didn't I? Whether it's cyclamates, red number 2, or whatever, FDA seems to keep cropping up in the news. What is wrong with FDA?
Well, I don't think those necessarily follow each other.
I can reverse the order.
I think that FDA is very much in the news, and in some respects that's quite flattering. Because it means we're newsworthy, it means people are interested in what we're doing and why we're doing it. And I think the reason for that is very clear if you stop and think about what you do when you get up in the morning. Most people, by the time they finish breakfast, have come into contact with 20 or 30 products that we regulate. Everything that you eat, all the drugs you take, your television set, you came down on an airplane and your luggage was looked at by an x-ray machine. Everything that you put on your skin or smear on or whatever, we regulate. And people want to know about these products. Secondly, everybody is very much an expert about what they eat, and they have very strong feelings about this, strong beliefs. And when we don't meet the expectations of people, then there is some disappointment. You put these two things together, and you can come up with a question that I think is a bad question. What's wrong with FDA? I'd much prefer to talk about what's right about FDA, and I could use up then the whole
Just try it. Dr. Halberstam, as a physician dealing with patients on a daily basis, can you tell our audience why an individual patient or consumer should be concerned about drug regulation in our country?
Yeah, I think it's clear to most people who read the newspapers why they should be concerned about drug regulation, because if they read the newspapers, they read all the time about drugs which can do bad things to them, particularly if they read the newspapers in Washington, D.C. They should be concerned for another reason, which does not get into the paper, and that is that there are drugs that have not been available to them which can do good things for them with some certain predictable side effects, which have not been available to them. This is the so-called drug lag, and it's been an issue which has been overlooked, but it is a real issue. I think as a practicing physician, I feel a little bit like the child when I read the journals that are published in England, the medical journals, Lancet and the British Medical Journal. I feel like a little child with my nose pressed up against the toy store window, seeing these marvelous things inside that I can't get at. And it's been true now with a number of drugs for 5, 6, 7, 8 years. We're doing better on that, but it has been a problem, and it remains a problem for the consumer.
Dr. Lasagna, as an expert in this field, for example, where does the drug lag exist? With what drugs, sir?
I'll give a few examples. There's an extremely interesting drug called beclomethasone, which for certain kinds of serious asthmatics is a remarkably effective drug. And I find it ridiculous that seriously asthmatic patients from Rochester, New York have to go across the Canadian border to Hamilton, Ontario to get this drug at the moment. There are two drugs that are used in the treatment of a variety of cardiovascular diseases, which have been shown in controlled experiments done elsewhere to cut the mortality of patients who have been discharged from a hospital after a heart attack by about 40% on average. We've calculated that that could mean a saving of about 10,000 lives a year in this country. Those drugs are not available. There are others, but that gives you a feeling for the problem.
Why aren't they available, Commissioner Schmidt?
Well, there are many different reasons for what different people have termed the drug lag. I think that the first thing to say is that in 1962 we put a system of regulation of drug development and marketing in place in this country that was not in place in England or in many other countries. England, for example, got an efficacy requirement. That is, their drugs had to be shown to be effective for the purposes claimed before marketing. This requirement came along in England just 2.5 years ago. We have safety requirements for drugs. We have rather stringent requirements now about how one can develop drug, how one can use people to do research. And these requirements have been put in place as a matter of public policy. I think it is undeniable that one pays a price in time, in dollars, in manpower for having drugs shown to be safe and effective before they're marketed in this country. And I think that most people agree that the price is worth paying. So that the first element is that you can't compare this country with its requirements with another country that has no such requirements. Secondly, drug firms, and most large drug firms, are multinational. They can pick and choose where it is that they develop drugs. And if they look in this country, for example, and have IND requirements, they have institutional review committees in place, they have informed consent for the clinical research requirements. We're now talking about mandating follow-up requirements for patients. So a company looks at developing a drug here versus going to a foreign country where they have a subsidiary, where they can cheaply, quickly, and easily develop the drug, and you can decide where it is that drug company would go to experiment with the drug and first introduce the drug. Beclomethasone, which Lou mentioned, the asthma drug, was developed overseas. It was introduced in England many years before it came here. It came here just a couple of years ago as an application to us. The application was deficient. We have been working as quickly as we can to bring that drug into the marketplace in this country when our requirements are satisfied. But we cannot approve a drug for which we don't have an application. So this drug leg thing has to be analyzed. It has to be broken down. I think Lou has said that there's never been a drug leg really in antibiotics or in certain other drugs. Cardiovascular drugs, I think, has been the big problem that many people have pointed to.
Senator Nelson, on the theory that where there's smoke, there ought to be fire, or maybe fire, is there something wrong at FDA from your point of view?
I wish you'd quit asking that question. I don't like your assumption.
I don't mean to be a provocateur, Commissioner Schmidt, but I do mean to keep the conversation moving. I'm not sure that's really necessary. I have a feeling this conversation may snowball all itself all alone. Senator?
Well, I have conducted hearings for 8 years in the field of drugs, starting back in '67. And though I think there are many things wrong with both the law, the administration of the law, I have spent most of my time defending the Food and Drug Administration against assault from people who would like to destroy the laws that we have, i.e. the requirement that you must prove safety and efficacy by adequately controlled scientific studies, and that's what the issue's all about. It's nothing to put a drug into the market in a country which doesn't make any pretense of protecting its citizens at all. So chloramphenicol is spread all over the world. It's a dangerous, serious drug, widely used for improper purposes, with all kinds of people getting blood dyscrasias, aplastic anemia, with no warning whatsoever. We don't allow that in this country, and we shouldn't. Just to add to what Dr. Schmidt said, we announced hearings with plenty of notice. Every drug company in this country had notice and the right to come to the hearings. Joe Stetler appeared for the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association on this precise question of whether or not there's a significant drug lag in the country. Now, of course, there's a lag if you require proof of efficacy and safety, and that's a necessary lag that I find nobody, no responsible scientist in this country who would dispose of it. Now, you may very well improve upon the speed with which it's handled, and the drug companies improve upon the quality of the research that they present, but nobody would want to destroy that law.
As far as what's the matter with the FDA, I don't believe that we should forget that the Food and Drug Administration is doing its very best to carry out the laws as written. And if there is a problem, then I think we have to look at the cost and benefits of the impact of the laws as they are written. The allegation that we are the only country that has drug registration procedures that protect the people, I think would be deeply offensive to Sweden and to England and to a number of other countries that take justifiable pride in having an extremely high standard of review before registration. So the problem comes down then to what do you mean by safe and what do you mean by effective? And with all respect, Senator, there is no such thing as a scientific proof of safety or effectiveness. Safety and effectiveness are value judgments. Those judgments may be informed by scientific data, the amount of data and the character of data that one demands before he makes the judgment is, again, a matter of custom, a matter of tradition, and indeed a very changeable kind of position. I think that what we have in the United States today is a very clear position, which the FDA is administering as well as it can under, I think, assaults that confuse its charge and a judgment of the validity of the charge. I think many people criticize the FDA for a question of the validity of the legislation under which they are working. There are problems with how they administer the legislation, to be sure. But my own view is that the FDA is doing its very best to carry out the charges that they have. The problem is, where do we find the forum to discuss the public benefits and the public deficits of the law as it now exerts itself in practice, not in intent, because the intent is unexceptionable, but observing how the law exerts itself in practice, where the FDA is a scapegoat, the pharmaceutical industry is a scapegoat, the medical profession is a scapegoat. Something, it seems to me, is awry, and I would seek the forum where a calm concern with the public interest, rather than an unrelenting search for scapegoats, could be established.
Dr. Halberstam?
Jules, I don't think anyone would argue that the need for safety testing in drugs, but I think it's disingenuous to say that that there is not a significant drug lag. This is a concept that was developed in part by Dr. Lasagna and Dr. Wardell, and I noticed that in his speech at Tulane back in November, Senator Kennedy, who's been interested in drugs, admitted that there had been a drug lag and indeed proposed something to do something about it. And I think that Dr. Schmidt himself, in a few days later in his speech in New Orleans, acknowledged that perhaps there had been a lag, although we were getting better. But for the practicing physician and for the patient, the drug lag still exists, and it's very significant. In the New England Journal of Medicine, in May 15th, 75, in a special article entitled "Unapproved Drugs in the Practice of Medicine," two physicians writing about this beclomethasone, which is a steroid drug which is not absorbed into the system. It works within the lungs, and therefore you don't have the systemic effects of cortisone. Two physicians wrote that on the basis of past experience, years will pass before beclomethasone will be approved by the FDA. Needlessly, during this period, many children will be stunted in growth and adults will suffer spinal fractures. In the patient's best interest, the physician must advise leaving the country or obtaining the drug illegally. Now, the two physicians were Francis Cabot Lowell and William Franklin, who are two of the leading allergists and professors of medicine in Boston at the Mass General. Now, I submit that if that had been written about side effects from a drug, we would have had stories and hearings all over us. But because it was written about the unavailability of a drug, not very much was said about it. The drug lag exists. We should accept it and try to find ways to minimize it without endangering patients.
No radicals, certainly.
No radicals.
Just so that I'm clear, I didn't say there wasn't a drug lag, and I didn't say that in administration couldn't be improved. I said there's bound to be some lag in any country that has a standard such as we have against a country that has no standard, such as Mexico, or a big majority.
We're not talking about Mexico. We're talking about Great Britain.
Well, they're on Britain too.
Or Sweden.
Yeah, there are about four that you could say had some pretty good standards. As I've looked at those statutes, that's about all. To improve on that, we ought to do something about the law. I would agree, and you can improve on it. The FDA ought to have the authority, which the medical profession won't like, to to have post-regulatory authority over a drug in the marketplace. Now, if a very potent, important drug that has a very limited usage, such as chloramphenicol had from the beginning, though it wasn't used that way, widely misused and still is. If it's a potent drug with a very limited usage and dangerous and might be widely used for the wrong purposes, as chloramphenicol was and many others too, the FDA ought to have the authority to say we will allow that into the marketplace under these conditions, and name the conditions, that it may only be administered in a hospital situation, or some other conditions to control it from being widely misused, as a substantial percentage of the drugs in the marketplace are widely misused now. Secondly, the admitted commissioner ought to have authority without having to go to court every time he tries to protect the public and brought there by the drug companies. He ought to have the authority, if additional evidence of some risk or danger comes, to add further conditions or remove it from the marketplace without having to go to court to do so. This would have a very important effect on being able to get drugs into the marketplace more quickly and to get them out or limit their use more quickly.
Lou? Could I raise a couple of issues that I think Mac, Schmidt, and I could agree upon? They relate to deficiencies of the FDA but are no fault of the FDA. I refer to the inadequate funding of the FDA and the inadequate numbers of personnel. It seems to me that society is, by and large, continually thrusting upon the FDA more and more tasks without the wherewithal to achieve those tasks. And I think we ought to either stop pushing these additional responsibilities on the FDA or give them the money and the manpower to do the job. I don't think that the way we're going about it now is really productive and in society's best interests.
We seem to be a society searching for scapegoats in too many ways, and certainly there are enough things we've found that are wrong, but as a newsman, I find half my desk is covered with unresolved drug issues and medical issues, whether it's malpractice or chloramphenicol or cromolyn, you name it.
I'm getting to be an expert on beclomethasone, because when people talk about the drug leg, and they got their nose pressed up to the window looking at the goodies inside and so on, the goodie is always beclomethasone. We got a one-drug drug leg.
No, I have propranolol.
And the other thing that offends me just a teeny little bit is that people assume that we're back there saying, ha, there's beclomethasone, we're going to ignore it for another day. Or something like that.
I have no idea what goes on back there.
First of all, the assumption that it's going to be a long time, years before beclomethasone makes its foggy appearance out there is erroneous. We will approve beclomethasone as soon as it meets the requirements that have been established by the Congress of the United States, as we have interpreted those requirements. One of the things that I would like to do very, very much, and I cannot to the extent that I would like, is to explain to everybody what it is we're doing with beclomethasone.
I will give you 1 minute.
Well, we are prohibited by law from discussing things like safety and efficacy data that I do not believe should be in the realm of trade secret. We should be able, in open advisory committee session, to take up beclomethasone and discuss in public session what the deficiencies are in the demonstration of safety and efficacy, and get consensus as to what it is, on what basis that drug will be approved, and when we can approve it. And then all of this nonsense about what we're doing or not doing will go away. And then, if public policy needs to be changed, you can beat on whom I'd much rather everybody beats on, which is Congress, to change the law than us.
Well, you see, the physician doesn't know what's going on and who's responsible, but it's clearly not a one-drug issue. In December of 1972, again in the New England Journal, in a series of articles on treatment of hypertension, Lot Page and Sid discussed the treatment of hypertension, and they discussed the use of propranolol, which is what's called a beta blocker, a new class of drug in the treatment of hypertension, and they just treated it as they discussed all the other classes of drugs. And I had to write a letter I didn't have to, but I did write a letter to the New England Journal pointing out that it was a very interesting article, but the authors had forgotten to mention that propranolol was not approved for the use of treatment of hypertension. And this article appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine by two distinguished experts. My letter appeared in the spring of 73. It's been 3 years now. It still isn't approved for the use of hypertension. Its approval for in angina pectoris, heart pain from coronary artery disease, was dreadfully slow. And if people hadn't just ignored the FDA and gone ahead and used it without the sanction, thousands of patients would have died, and hundreds of thousands would have been in much more distress. It's not a one-drug issue.
There's an optimization problem that we're walking around. The 62 amendments were very heavily influenced by the thalidomide disaster. The amendments on the floor that are an important part of the history of that legislation all came after review, and it was a reaction against a terrible thing that just couldn't be allowed to happen again. And out of that came a mood of optimizing the safety of the products that were presented to the public. Very little in the history of that legislation urges on the Food and Drug Administration a role of advocacy to move into even a limited use as rapidly as possible as reason would allow a new agent. The entire history is one of constraint. And I think it is true, as has been said, that the FDA has never been criticized for delaying the introduction of an agent, but has frequently been criticized for making a positive decision. And most of the most recriminatory hearings that the FDA has been exposed to have been on the allegation of moving too rapidly. Now, if you add a very high degree of data support of a judgment of safety and efficacy, and a legislation whose history is based really on the prevention of another thalidomide disaster, and nowhere in the history of the legislation is the FDA charged with moving into the public realm and to the public benefit as soon as feasible a new therapeutic entity, then I think it is inevitable that it will take longer to move a new agent in that setting than where those conditions do not exist. I don't believe that that means that these agents will not be available. They will be, but they will be available in a longer period of time. And what we have is a very difficult judgment, is that somewhat longer period of time and the loss of benefits that would be available had the drug been available in that time, larger or smaller as a public benefit than the demonstrable degree of protection against another thalidomide disaster. And this is a relativistic thing. It's not all or none. There are no white hats and black hats. There are no bad boys and good boys. It is an exquisitely difficult question, and what we lack in the United States today is a forum where people of responsibility can calmly and objectively explore those questions.
Which I hope we're doing at least partly here. Dr. Lasagna.
So may I enlarge the discussion a little bit by referring to an international drug lag, if you will. We're not the country that approves all drugs the last. I mean, we are occasionally ahead of other countries. I find it strange that a country should be approved in one country ahead of it. A drug should be approved in one country ahead of another. It seems to me that ideally, when a drug has been demonstrated to be effective and to appear to have a reasonable track record as far as safety, it ought to be available to all sick people all over the world.
At a reasonable price.
At a reasonable price.
Reasonable
Now,
profit as well.
I think at the moment we're duplicating a lot of studies needlessly in various countries, in part because of a jingoistic approach to whose data is better than anybody else's. I don't believe one should have to repeat controlled experiments in the United States, for example, if impeccable trials have been performed in Sweden or Switzerland or the United Kingdom or any other country where there are responsible investigators capable of doing good work. And the reverse should also be true. And I would hope we could aim for the day when a company could actually file an international new drug application and hope to get it approved simultaneously all over the world. At the moment, my hunch is that there are countries that have standards that are too lax, by my criteria, and that we are at one other end of the spectrum demanding more than I think is reasonable in the way of evidence. Now, if that's a matter of the law or the regulations, then we ought to change those. If it's a matter of interpretation, then that's another matter.
I would say we published quite recently final regulations that set out the conditions under which we will accept foreign-generated data and use it for the purposes of evaluating a drug in this country. I think that when the studies are impeccably done in other countries and we can look at the raw data when we need to, then there is no problem, and we would share available data with other countries. I think that would help. The problem is that in many countries, studies are poorly done. In many countries, the type of data that they accept for demonstration of efficacy is just simply not acceptable in this country. And I think that in addition, we have to have some kind of a common agreement as to the quality of data that are acceptable.
Style of informed consent.
Well, there are a number of issues that are very important. Informed consent, the ethics of research. There's a lot of feeling that we should not benefit by exploitation of citizens of countries that don't have the protections of the research subjects that we do in our country. If we do, I think a marvelous example of what many of you all have been talking about is coming down the pike right now, because we are in the process of developing regulations that would make mandatory the following of patients for years after they had been experimental subjects, if there was a reason to do so. This would be a commitment on the part of a drug developer to invest the resources necessary to track down everybody, do examinations, and so on, if an adverse reaction to that drug turned up.
Who decides if there's a reason to do so, Dr. Schmidt?
Well, the way we're writing the regulations, we would. And there is reason for this, because we would be, in effect, in the best position to know. But now just stop and think for a moment. We had a hearing that you want to know what's wrong with FDA. If you listen to what was in that congressional hearing, you would think that one of the things wrong with FDA is that we have never promulgated those regulations. If we promulgate those regulations, they would then impact to a significant degree on the cost of doing research in this country. They would contribute to a drug lag, if there is such a thing. They would tend to drive research overseas. They would tend to stifle innovation in this country. These are the charges that are thrown against FDA for its regulations. And it's interesting to me that the real issue is a public policy issue of whether or not in this country subjects of research are to have the protection of the commitment of the sponsor of that research for long-term follow-up for any adverse reaction that develops as a result of that research. Now, we aren't there yet, but I can see coming all of the things that are talked about in terms of our present regulations, how we carry out mandates of the law, and so on. And I would sincerely wish that in Dr. Hubbard's public forum, there would be a consensus developed as to whether or not we should have those regulations in this country. If so, then I want the dollars and the people and the elbow room to do a good job of regulating that aspect of drug development.
But you all are again, you're arguing extremes. What we have is a problem of an investigator in a country that is unexceptionable in terms of the ethics of the country. But where the style is that you do not get the patient to sign when he gives informed consent, nor is it the style to make a record of that informed consent. And so you come to examine the data and you find that in our terms it cannot be proven that these patients actually gave consent. All you have is the investigator's word.
Let me ask a further question. Did you're satisfied, or I understand you say, with the NAS program established by the FDA and the responsibility given to them? Now, if you have them...
Senator, I'm satisfied with the science. I grew up in it. I'm part of it.
Well, I'm trying to figure out, Dr. Hubbard, what you're talking about. What is it that you think ought to be done?
I think that he is talking about something that any one of us could and that we would agree to, and that is that there are things that can now be done to improve the system that we have based on the FD&C Act and the 62 amendments. I think that a sharpening of FDA's authority, provision of, in certain areas, provision of resources to carry out that authority, the planning of research in a more cogent and open way so that everybody knows what the requirements are in advance of conducting the research. I think that a sequential review of how the drug is being developed with some sign from the Food and Drug Administration along the way as to how things are going. I think that expediencies in a number of areas can improve the system. Some will take legislation, and I think that really is what many of us are talking about when we talk about reform of the drug regulation system. And that is agreeing as to what the system is about, being sure that it's equipped properly, and then working to make it as efficient as it can be.
I think briefly, Lou, the fundamental disagreement between scientists in general and people within our regulatory agency. If, for example, articles appear in reputable journals around the world that say that a drug is effective, the scientific community accepts those. There's a feeling of belief and faith, whereas in our regulatory agency, the feeling is just the opposite, that without those individual patient sheets being sent in for scrutiny, one cannot believe investigators. Now, that is a fundamental difference. I'm sure the FDA could argue that they occasionally find investigators who don't tell the truth, but that is a big difference, it seems to me.
It's hard to see any perspective also on the part of FDA in terms of urgency for certain drugs in certain situations. It seems, or it may not be true, that the same slow process is gone through when a drug is a dramatic innovation which has no precedent and where there is no challenger, and for a drug which is only moderately different for a much more minor condition. And while there may be some sense of urgency and where there may be some perspective, it doesn't seem to seep through.
Well, one of the reasons we keep asking for all these pieces of paper that have the data supporting the contentions on them is that I have to keep taking them up to Congress and showing Congress.
Well, no one ever said that you had an easy job.
And you should have to.
Well, I think
Have
so.
you two gentlemen met? Is it not true that fewer and fewer NDAs are filed each year?
Well, it's very interesting. If we talk about what's important, and that is new chemical entities, new drugs, one finds some very interesting things, briefly. One is that the decline in new chemical entities began before 1962. Secondly, since 1962, the new chemical entity, the rate of development, has been fairly constant, has turned in the last year or two, so that more have been showing up for approval and more have been approved in the last 2 years.
In other words, there wasn't a drug lag, but it's better.
There are intellectual drug lags.
It's like a consent decree, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a famous drug lag between the time that Paul Ehrlich did his first chemotherapeutic work and the time of the sulfonamides. You can't find highly significant chemotherapeutic entities in that period. Biologics, yes. Now, why, with all that chemistry was doing, did we have that enormous lag of new chemical entities over that span of years? It's one of the great mysteries in the history of pharmacology. So that I don't know whose side I'm on, but when you
I think
talk
you're
about
walking a plank all by
when you try to talk about drug lag, you're talking about a great complex of problems, and it starts with the intellect. And it is not possible to forecast a specific rate. And it is not guaranteed that you will have the same number of significant new chemical entities every year. And history points out an interval long before the Food and Drug Administration was even conceived of, where there was a very remarkable drug lag that to this day has no explanation. So drug lags are real, but they are extremely complex. And you have to be very cautious about how you ask the question. Now, if you ask it the other way, given an entity, how long does it take to go through the steps that come to registration, you can come out with a fairly straightforward response. But the whole concept of drug lag is a different concept than the length of time it takes for the registration of a new entity.
As the discussion so far has shown, the regulation of drugs is not simple. Often there are 2, 3, or even more sides to an issue. Experts with the same goal, that is, improving the health and comfort of patients, often see things differently when it comes to whether the Food and Drug Administration is doing too much or too little. To dig more deeply into this, let's now challenge our speakers on drug regulation by calling on the experts in our audience.
As I'm sure that both Senator Nelson and Dr. Hubbard are aware, Commissioner Schmidt has proposed that there be a Phase 4 with respect to drug regulation. And I would like to have a comment from both of them as to what they think this would do in Dr. Hubbard's case for the drug industry, and as far as Senator Nelson is concerned, is for the safety and efficacy of
What's Phase 4?
drugs.
Post-marketing.
Oh, that's...
Maybe would Dr. Schmidt like
20 seconds
explain
each,
that?
gentlemen. The watches start running.
Well, we have postulated that it would be good to be able to trade off, in effect, in some instances, earlier approval of drugs if, upon their marketing in this country, some controls could be exerted that would allow us to determine things about the use of that drug that one could learn by looking at wide experience with the drug. So this kind of Phase 4 trial would be, in effect, a study of the early use of the drug in commercial sales.
That was 40 seconds, Commissioner.
Sorry.
You want to try that, Senator? 30 seconds.
I proposed that respecting chloramphenicol 5 years ago. We have legislation almost completed in my office to introduce to do exactly that now.
Why has it taken 5 years?
I didn't get around to drafting the legislation until now. That's the main reason. Do you think of a better reason?
I can give you several.
In the meantime, I have drafted all kinds of...
Dr. Halberstam?
Yeah. As a practicing physician, I think that there is validity to the idea of releasing drugs in a somewhat controlled way rather than the all or none situation that we have now. But I think that we make a mistake if we release them only to certain classes of doctors. I think the Congress, which has been trying to turn out family practitioners as a special effort, will get into trouble about that. And I think that the effort should be designed to release drugs for certain conditions, for certain patients, and not as a research tool primarily, but as a way of getting specific drugs out to specific patients.
I see it as a plausible and useful idea. The difficulties are enormous. If you release only to hospitals, what are you going to say to the pharmacist in the local pharmacy? Well, you can go on and on. How many patients would you like to have? Will the patients be seen in a circumstance different enough from the circumstance under which phase 3 was done so you're actually increasing your experience? How rare an example would you like to protect against? 1 in 10,000? 1 in 50,000? The problem is not the validity of the concept, but being able to manage it in such a way that it responds to the individual case. And what I fear...
That's time, Dr. Hubbard.
What I fear is that it would be legalistically interpreted so that this kind of discretion would not be available, and then it would be a tragedy.
This gentleman here. Yeah. Before we have seconds, let's have firsts.
Dave O'Neill, I'm an economist, with the Center for Naval Analysis. I'd like this, Dr. Schmidt, not so much as a specialist and not in the drug or health area, but just sort of as a patient I'm interested in organization theory. There's been a lot of talk about judges and juries, and you're obviously all concerned with the adversary process, and you talk about the National Academy of Science. You've been getting around this sort of thing, and I know the National Academy of Science from other areas, and I wouldn't be too impressed with them as my advocate. But let me ask you a question a different way. Suppose that you're dealing now with a certain drug, and you feel the probability you're using, let's say, is 1 chance in 10, that you feel if that's it, you're not going to let the drug out. And let's say all the councils in the National Academy of Science agree with you. But let's just say that out in the population, a large majority of people would really like to run a higher risk. Could you just sort of go about and describe what kind of processes would take place to get you to change your mind about the thing? How the National Academy of Science would play a role, how Dr. Lasagna would play a role. The question is not asked, it's asked in the hope of maybe stimulating some insight into this process that Mr. Hubbard keeps talking about, the big arena that we all want to get at. Thank you.
Well, our subject tonight is reform of the drug regulatory process. And one of the things that is common to almost everyone's program of reform is some kind of an appeal mechanism from the agency's decision. In many of the bills, there is a drug appeals committee. We have been reading about science courts, which is a very interesting concept. We set out in our draft procedural regulations the concept of a science board. I'm blocking the name now. Board of Inquiry, a scientific board of inquiry. To me, there is nothing wrong or bad or anything else about having our decision reviewed in the public arena, as long as it was fair and unbiased. You see, the problem is now the only things that get reviewed that we do are controversial decisions for drug approvals. And you can always find somebody who says that drug shouldn't have been approved. When we approve it, we are benefiting the industry. Therefore, since it's a conventional wisdom for 50 years that regulatory agencies are sold out to those they regulate, therefore we're sold out to the industry, and on we go. That kind of appeal mechanism is for the birds. A sound scientific one that took into account the people that needed the drug and the druthers of the country and so on, I would not object to at all.
Next question. Before I call on seconds, I want to make sure I haven't ignored. I've got all the first. This gray-haired gentleman back there in the next to last row.
I'm Herrick Peterson. I'm editor of Patient Care, a controlled circulation publication going to family physicians, general internists, DOs. I would like to know if the panelists consider it feasible that the government, particularly the FDA, relieve the pharmaceutical industry and the physician of some of the onus for informing the patient of the risk benefits of drugs? Isn't it incumbent upon the patient to learn from some other source that there are risks as well as benefits in drug therapy?
I would take a cut at that by saying that, yes, I think in this country we need to do a much better job of explaining risk to everyone and pointing out that there is no effective drug that is absolutely safe, and for that matter, almost any manipulation of the natural environment entails some risk. So in general, we need to say that, but that won't do the job, because there can be two different drugs, many different kinds of adverse effects. There need to be often patient attention paid to what might develop. It might be very important for the patient to recognize specific side effects. I think there is need to be very specific with patients about a particular drug, and I don't think that any general educational program can do that job.
That was a healthy cut, I would say. Dr. Lasagna is going to
May I tell you what patients would like to have, at least the ones we've talked to? Most patients we've talked to are dissatisfied with the amount of information they have about drugs, both ethical drugs and over-the-counter drugs. If you ask them what would be their preferred source of information, major source of information, for ethical drugs it's the physician, and for over-the-counter drugs it's the pharmacist. They give the media a very low rating indeed. Now, they can't say much about patient package inserts because they haven't had that opportunity, so one will have to do some experimentation with patient package inserts to find out how important a medium that would be.
The media, was it the media you said that gets a low rating?
Yes.
The media deserves a low rating.
That was asked of the panel, was it not? Can I comment on that?
Sure.
I think for the practicing physician, it might be very nice if the FDA took all the onus for informing patients, because clearly in internal medicine, one of the major risks of malpractice, since we internists do not do surgery, is in drug reactions, and it's a constant concern of the internist. And if each patient got all the information that was required through package inserts or through the FDA, it might be fine in a medical legal sense with the physician. I don't think it would really be of a service to the patient, however, and I think most physicians would resent it because the information has to be applied individually. The absurdity of this is seen in some of the warnings to patients, official warnings, that this medication, for example, should not be taken if you are driving a car. Should not be taken at the same time as alcohol. That prohibition, not an official FDA prohibition, I should say, but promulgated by pharmacologists, by pharmacists, not by university pharmacologists, is found with a large number of tranquilizers. Well, if people who take tranquilizers did not drive, we would have a quarter of the cars in the United States off the streets. I mean, clearly these the absolutely contraindications are not absolute, but when you get them on a piece of paper, they look all equal and they look absolute.
This lady back here has been dying to ask a question.
June O'Neill, Council of Economic Advisors, another economist. I wondered whether the same standards are in fact used for approving a drug as for banning a drug or for warning about a drug. It seems, well, just as a superficial reader of the paper, that the standards are really rather weak for casting doubt about a drug. For example, recently a warning has been given about the birth control pill. Now, that was based on a study published in a British journal. The study was based on 50 women, most of whom smoked. It was not as a statistician, it was not really an overwhelmingly convincing study. It seemed to say more about the relationship between smoking and taking the pill than it did about the pill and heart attacks. But
excellent
I'm sure
question.
it's frightened a lot of women.
Very good question. Certainly, the data needed to approve a drug has to be much more rigorous than the data needed to come out with a warning. If, a warning is just that. We require controlled studies and a lot of things for approval of a drug. We do not require that same kind of proof for a warning. If we did, it really wouldn't be a warning then in the sense that we say there are some data that show that this may be true. That's what a warning is all about. And we will warn physicians that there are these data on a less sound basis than we would require for approving a drug or taking it off the market.
Well, things could be approved with a warning. There could be something in between direct rejection. They could be approved with a warning. But it's not, it's...
Yeah, well, a number of you have touched on something, and I would say to you, read our hearings. Read what happens to our
You've got to be
controversial...
kidding. Who can read your hearings?
Well, I have to sit through them so other people can read them.
I'm sorry, panel and audience, we're out of time.
We hope we've shed a little bit of light as well as some smoke.
Thank you for your patience, panel. Thank you, audience, for joining us.
This roundtable discussion on the problems of drug regulation has brought you the views of 5 experts in the field. It was presented by the AEI Center for Health Policy Research. It is the aim of AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, to clarify issues of the day by presenting many differing views in the hope that by so doing, those who wish to be informed about the decision-making process will benefit from such a free exchange of informed and enlightened opinion. I'm Peter Hackus in Washington.
Public Policy Forums is created and supplied to this station as a public service by the American Enterprise Institute, Washington, D.C. For a copy of this program, write to the American Enterprise Institute at 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036.